The airport was buzzing with its usual energy, a symphony of rolling luggage, announcements echoing through the concourse, and the soft hum of travelers lost in their own worlds. Amid the chaos, a young black girl, just 16, maneuvered her carry-on with practiced ease, weaving through crowds of hurried business travelers, parents with fussy toddlers, and the occasional distracted tourist. Her name was Aaliyah, and though she had flown before, traveling alone always carried a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Today, however, the air seemed thicker, charged with a tension she couldn't quite place. Aaliyah's flight was scheduled for mid-afternoon, a direct route to visit her aunt in another state. She had meticulously packed her backpack with essentials, a novel she had been saving for this journey, a notebook filled with sketches, her headphones, and a small bottle of water. Each item was carefully placed to ensure she would have everything she might need for the hours ahead. She had double-checked her boarding pass, ensured her ID was accessible, and had even arrived early to avoid the stress of rushing through security. Her mother had hugged her tightly at the entrance of the terminal, whispering reminders about manners, staying alert, and keeping her phone charged. The security line moved smoothly, and Aaliyah found herself stepping into the terminal proper, the smell of coffee and pretzels mingling with the faint scent of jet fuel drifting from the tarmac. She followed the signs to her gate, her eyes scanning the electronic boards for any changes. Everything seemed normal, almost routine. That is, until she noticed a flight attendant standing near the gate, watching her more closely than anyone had a reason to. At first, Aaliyah tried to ignore it, thinking perhaps the attendant was just doing her job. But as she approached the counter to ask a quick question about her seat, the woman's gaze lingered on her in a way that felt deliberate, uncomfortable. The attendant's expression was polite, but her eyes betrayed suspicion, a subtle tightening of her lips, a faint narrowing of her eyes. Aaliyah forced herself to smile, attempting small talk about the flight, but it was clear the woman wasn't engaging in casual conversation. She was observing, calculating, evaluating. Aaliyah's heart rate quickened, a mix of unease and confusion washing over her. She had never experienced anything like this on a flight before. Most flight attendants treated her the same as any other passenger, polite, professional, courteous. But this time felt different. The attendant stepped back from the counter, subtly reaching for a small radio clipped to her belt. Aaliyah noticed her hand hover for a moment longer than necessary before she pressed a button and spoke in hushed tones. The words were unintelligible to Aaliyah, but the urgency in the woman's voice was unmistakable. Minutes later, a uniformed police officer appeared near the gate, walking briskly toward her. The bustling terminal seemed to slow, or perhaps Aaliyah's perception of it slowed, as she tried to process what was happening. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain that she was traveling alone and meant no harm, but the officer's expression stopped her. He didn't smile. He didn't offer reassurance. Instead, there was a kind of preemptive suspicion in his posture, a readiness to act before even knowing the facts. Other passengers began to notice the growing tension. Some glanced over with curiosity, others with concern, whispering to their companions. Aaliyah felt eyes on her from all directions, as if the entire terminal was now judging her. She could hear snatches of conversation, murmurs that weren't directed at her but somehow felt like accusations. Why is there a cop talking to that girl? What did she do? This doesn't seem right. Every word felt like a weight pressing on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She tried to remain calm, reminding herself that she had done nothing wrong. She had her boarding pass, her ID, and a calm demeanor, yet somehow these facts seemed irrelevant in the situation unfolding. The flight attendant approached her again, her tone now softer but still pointed. "I just need to ask you a few questions," she said. Aaliyah nodded, hoping her compliance would diffuse the situation, but inside, panic bubbled like water on the verge of boiling. The officer's voice was firm. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you." The phrasing was polite, yet every syllable carried a weight that made Aaliyah's stomach twist. She tried to explain herself, that she was traveling alone to visit family, that her mother had arranged everything, that she posed no threat. But her words seemed to vanish into the noise of the terminal, unheard or dismissed. Aaliyah's mind raced. She replayed every step she had taken since entering the airport, trying to figure out what could have triggered this response. Was it her appearance? The way she carried herself? The fact that she was alone? She couldn't pinpoint a single reason. And yet, here she was, being treated as if she were guilty of something she hadn't done, surrounded by strangers whose eyes measured her like she was on trial. The tension escalated as more passengers began to observe, some taking out their phones, some whispering under their breath. The air seemed charged with anticipation, every small movement magnified. Aaliyah felt trapped in a spotlight she hadn't asked for, every glance from the flight attendant and the officer a reminder that she was under scrutiny for reasons beyond her control. She tried to steady her breathing, counting silently, willing herself to remain composed. In the midst of this, a kind older woman sitting nearby leaned over and whispered, "Don't let them get to you, dear. You're doing nothing wrong." Aaliyah offered a faint smile, grateful for the small gesture of empathy, but it did little to calm the storm of anxiety building inside her. She clutched her backpack strap tightly, feeling the reassuring texture of the fabric under her fingers, a small anchor in a sea of confusion. Time seemed to stretch. Each passing second carried the weight of uncertainty. The officer asked more questions, each one probing, each one layered with a suspicion Aaliyah couldn't comprehend. She answered politely, clearly, with all the facts, yet nothing seemed to satisfy the growing scrutiny. Her voice shook only slightly, betraying the fear she worked so hard to conceal. The passengers around her shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others watching with barely contained disbelief. Aaliyah's thoughts drifted to her mother, imagining the disappointment and worry that would wash over her if she knew what was happening. She wished she could call her, explain, prove that she was safe, but her phone had limited signal near the gate, and the airport staff were making every step feel like a trial rather than a journey. She felt a wave of injustice, sharp and heavy, as though the world had suddenly turned against her for no reason other than being herself. The flight attendant's eyes never left her. There was a cold precision in her gaze, as though every movement Aaliyah made was being catalogued for evidence. The subtle gestures, the shift of weight from one foot to another, the nervous adjustment of her backpack, each was scrutinized, interpreted as potential guilt. Aaliyah's heart pounded in response, and her mind screamed at her to remain calm, to not give them a reason to escalate this further. Other travelers began murmuring amongst themselves, some expressing discomfort at the way she was being treated. A few shook their heads, muttering about fairness and decency, but no one stepped forward. The power dynamics were clear, and Aaliyah, despite being fully compliant and harmless, found herself caught in the middle of a situation far beyond her control. Her stomach twisted as the officer asked to see her identification again, even though she had already presented it multiple times. Each request seemed to underline a subtle but unmistakable message. Suspicion had taken root, and nothing she said or did could immediately dispel it. Aaliyah felt a lump rise in her throat, tears threatening to spill, but she blinked them back, refusing to let her vulnerability give more weight to an already unjust situation. She thought about her journey ahead, about the aunt who had been eagerly awaiting her arrival, about the sense of independence she had felt when she first boarded the airport, and she realized how quickly it had been stripped away. The simple act of traveling alone, which should have been routine and even empowering, had been transformed into a moment of fear, humiliation, and bewilderment. Aaliyah's mind raced for solutions, for ways to explain herself that would be heard, that would make the flight attendant see reason. She considered asking another staff member for help, seeking witnesses, or even requesting a supervisor. Every thought seemed like a potential lifeline, yet she knew the delicate balance of the situation meant any wrong word could make it worse. She felt acutely aware of her body, of every gesture, every blink, every tiny movement that could be misinterpreted. Minutes dragged on, stretched thin by the intensity of scrutiny. Aaliyah's breathing remained shallow, her mind alternating between fear and disbelief. She silently vowed to herself that no matter what happened, she would hold her head high, speak with clarity, and never internalize the unjust suspicion cast upon her. The terminal continued its usual flow around her, oblivious to the storm she navigated in the center of the crowd. Then, in the quiet moments between interactions, Aaliyah caught sight of a reflection in the polished surface of the gate counter. Her own eyes stared back at her, wide, anxious, but defiant. She saw herself not as the accused, but as a young woman enduring a moment of inexplicable adversity, a moment she would survive and remember with the clarity of injustice confronted and endured. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, trying to summon the calm she knew she needed, and prepared for whatever would happen next, unaware that the situation was about to take an unexpected turn that would leave everyone in the terminal utterly speechless. Aaliyah's heart raced as the situation at the gate escalated, each moment stretching into an eternity. The initial shock of seeing a police officer approach her had already left her disoriented, but now, as she processed the reality of what was happening, a deeper confusion and fear took hold. She had done nothing wrong. She had her boarding pass neatly tucked in her hand, her ID clipped in her bag for easy access, and she had followed every instruction at the airport to the letter. Yet here she was, being treated as if she were the source of some imagined threat. The disparity between her expectations and reality created a jarring sense of unreality, as if the world around her had suddenly tilted and she was trying to keep her balance on shifting ground. The terminal, once a familiar and almost comforting space, now seemed alien. The usual sounds, the distant echo of rolling suitcases, the chatter of travelers, the soft hum of planes taxiing in the distance, felt distorted, almost oppressive. Every announcement over the intercom seemed to linger longer in the air, punctuating the tension she felt. The scent of coffee, normally a pleasant reminder of bustling airport life, now mingled with the metallic, sharp odor of worry and fear. Even the fluorescent lighting overhead seemed harsher, spotlighting her in a way that made her hyper-aware of every movement she made. Her mind spun, trying to reconcile the kindness and routine she had always known with the suspicion she was now facing. Why her? She replayed her every interaction since arriving at the airport, analyzing her behavior, her posture, her expressions. She had smiled politely at the gate staff, asked questions respectfully, and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had navigated airports before. None of it should have caused alarm, and yet, here she was, under scrutiny. Aaliyah's chest tightened, each breath shallow and deliberate as she attempted to anchor herself in the rational truth: she had done nothing wrong. But rationality was a fragile shield against the storm of fear and confusion crashing around her. The officer's presence amplified the surreal quality of the situation. He stood a few feet away, watching her with a focused intensity that made it impossible to ignore him. His uniform, the polished badge, the radio clipped neatly to his shoulder, all symbols of authority, felt simultaneously distant and oppressive. Aaliyah could sense the eyes of passengers on her, subtle glances that weighed like unspoken judgment. Some faces were curious, some sympathetic, and others unreadable, but all contributed to the suffocating awareness that she was the center of unwanted attention. Each pair of eyes seemed to add weight to the invisible pressure pressing down on her chest. Aaliyah's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her backpack strap, the familiar texture providing a small measure of comfort. She tried to steady herself, telling herself that fear was a natural response to an unjust situation. She had learned, over years of navigating life in a world that sometimes judged harshly and unfairly, that fear could be managed by focusing on the facts, on what she could control. But this situation was so unpredictable, so outside of her control, that the usual strategies felt inadequate. The flight attendant approached again, her tone carefully neutral but tinged with an insistence that Aaliyah couldn't ignore. "I just need to confirm some information," she said, clipboard in hand. Aaliyah nodded, her voice barely above a whisper as she provided her full name, her destination, and her reason for traveling alone. She felt the words flow mechanically, as if repeating them over and over might make them real enough for the skeptical eyes watching her. Yet nothing seemed to satisfy the invisible criteria of suspicion. Each answer was met with a subtle frown or a pause, as if the attendant were measuring the truth behind every syllable. The confusion gnawed at Aaliyah. Why was she being treated like this? She had seen other travelers of all ages, races, and backgrounds pass through the gate without issue. She had never before been stopped, questioned, or scrutinized for her mere presence. The sense of injustice was overwhelming, compounded by the helplessness of being young, unarmed, and alone in a situation that seemed absurd yet painfully real. The contrast between the normality she had expected and the suspicion she faced made her feel as if she had stepped into a distorted version of reality, where logic and fairness were suspended. Her mind wandered to her mother, imagining the concern and panic that would consume her if she knew what was happening. She pictured the words her mother would use: calm instructions, gentle but firm reminders to stand tall, and reassurances that she was brave and capable. The thought was comforting, a mental lifeline, but also intensified the fear, because she knew her mother wasn't there, and Aaliyah had to face this alone. The absence of that protective presence magnified the weight of every gaze, every question, every pause from the staff. She noticed other passengers shifting in their seats and standing in line, their curiosity tinged with judgment. Aaliyah felt as though she were on display, a specimen under examination. She wondered if anyone truly understood the fear she felt, the unfairness of being singled out for reasons she could not comprehend. Some whispers reached her ears, snippets of conversation that seemed to confirm her worst suspicions, murmurs about protocol, security, and caution. Though none spoke her name or accused her directly, the air was thick with a collective sense of doubt that enveloped her like a cloud. Aaliyah's thoughts raced for ways to regain control. She considered speaking louder, asserting her innocence more forcefully, but fear of escalation held her back. She thought about showing identification again, explaining her travel arrangements, providing evidence of her family and her destination, but each potential solution carried the risk of further scrutiny. The internal conflict was exhausting. She needed to defend herself, but any misstep could worsen the situation. Each heartbeat was a reminder of her vulnerability, her isolation, and the precarious balance she had to maintain. Time seemed to stretch indefinitely. Every interaction, every glance, every pause became amplified. The flight attendant asked another question, her tone deceptively casual, but Aaliyah sensed the underlying tension. Each response required careful consideration, measured and precise, to avoid adding fuel to the invisible fire of suspicion. She answered as clearly and honestly as she could, hoping that her words would suffice, yet the growing anxiety made her doubt even her own perception of reality. Aaliyah's emotions oscillated between fear, confusion, and determination. She was terrified, but she refused to let panic consume her. She was confused, struggling to understand why she was being targeted when all evidence suggested she posed no threat. Yet, amid the fear and bewilderment, a quiet determination emerged. She would endure this moment with dignity, she would not let the fear define her, and she would face whatever came next with clarity and courage. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, focusing on the rhythm of her inhalation and exhalation to ground herself. The trembling in her hands subsided slightly, replaced by a tense but controlled alertness. She reminded herself that fear was natural, but action required composure. She would answer every question honestly, comply with requests, and maintain her poise. It was a delicate balance, and every small decision carried weight. Despite her attempts at calm, Aaliyah felt the isolation acutely. The crowded terminal, usually a place of bustling anonymity, now emphasized her singular presence. She was alone, a minor in an adult world where authority figures determined outcomes, and she was at their mercy. The weight of that realization was both frightening and clarifying, sharpening her awareness of every detail. The angle of the officer's stance, the tone of the flight attendant's voice, the subtle cues from nearby passengers. Memories of other travels surfaced in her mind, times she had navigated airports alone without incident, times when she had felt confident and independent. The stark contrast between those experiences and the current situation deepened her confusion. She could not reconcile the safety and routine of her previous journeys with the suspicion and fear now directed at her. The dissonance between expectation and reality created a surreal, almost dreamlike quality, heightening her sense of vulnerability. Every step she took, every word she spoke, felt fraught with consequence. The officer requested to see her documents again, and she complied without hesitation, her movements deliberate and careful. She noticed passengers exchanging glances, their curiosity mingled with judgment, and she felt a wave of self-consciousness, as if each action was magnified in their perception. The psychological weight of being scrutinized by authority and observed by peers was immense, and Aaliyah struggled to maintain her composure under the relentless pressure. Her thoughts turned inward, examining her own feelings, her fear, and her confusion. She questioned why her appearance, her presence, or her actions could trigger such a reaction. She analyzed every detail of her behavior, trying to identify a cause, but none existed. She had simply been herself, following the rules, traveling with honesty and transparency, and yet the world around her treated her as though she were guilty of some unseen transgression. The injustice was sharp, piercing, and impossible to ignore. Aaliyah's mind cycled through a series of hypothetical scenarios. What if she argued? What if she remained silent? What if she sought help from another staff member? What if she tried to leave the gate area? Each scenario carried risks, each choice fraught with uncertainty. The mental gymnastics exhausted her, yet she knew that clear thinking was her only tool to navigate this moment. She focused on the tangible facts, her identification, her boarding pass, her explanation for traveling alone, holding them as anchors in a storm of irrational suspicion. Despite the fear and confusion, a quiet resilience emerged. Aaliyah reminded herself of her strengths, her intelligence, her composure under pressure, her ability to navigate complex situations. She could not control the perceptions or biases of others, but she could control her responses. She would answer questions honestly, remain polite but firm, and endure this moment with dignity. It was a small but vital assertion of agency in a situation where she felt powerless. The minutes dragged on, each interaction amplifying the weight of scrutiny. Aaliyah's body tensed with anticipation, her mind oscillating between fear and strategic calculation. She noticed subtle shifts in the environment, passengers leaning forward, watching more intently, the officer's posture changing slightly as he listened, the flight attendant glancing at her notes, her expression inscrutable. Every detail mattered, every small cue carried meaning, and Aaliyah processed it all with heightened awareness, her confusion and fear mingled with a cautious vigilance. Amid the swirling anxiety, she clung to a core truth: she had done nothing wrong. That knowledge, though simple, became a lifeline. It grounded her, reminding her that despite the fear, the confusion, and the scrutiny, she was innocent. She would navigate this moment with honesty and poise, and she would survive it, because her integrity and resilience were stronger than the baseless suspicion directed at her. Aaliyah's thoughts began to shift from immediate fear to long-term reflection. She considered how she would explain this experience later, to her family, to friends, and perhaps even to strangers who would never understand the full weight of the moment. She realized that this experience, though painful and confusing, was also a testament to her strength, her ability to endure and maintain composure under extreme pressure. The fear would remain, but it would coexist with the knowledge of her resilience and dignity. As the officer and flight attendant continued their questioning, Aaliyah maintained her focus, answering each inquiry calmly, despite the tremor in her voice. She moved with deliberate care, aware of every gesture, every inflection, knowing that each could be interpreted in countless ways. The confusion still lingered, the fear still simmered beneath the surface, but she had found a fragile equilibrium, a way to navigate the moment without succumbing entirely to the chaos around her. The surrounding passengers remained a silent presence, their curiosity and judgment palpable. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others whispered quietly among themselves, and a few maintained neutral expressions, seemingly absorbed in their own affairs. Yet Aaliyah felt the weight of all eyes, the unspoken questions and assumptions pressing down on her like an invisible force. She tightened her grip on her backpack strap, grounding herself in the tangible sensation, a small but vital anchor amid the swirling confusion. She reflected on the surreal nature of the moment. Airports were supposed to be neutral spaces, designed for efficiency, safety, and orderly travel. Yet, here she was, caught in an arbitrary net of suspicion that seemed to defy logic and reason. The contrast between expectation and reality heightened her sense of disorientation, making it difficult to reconcile her normal understanding of how the world operated with the bizarre and frightening treatment she faced. Aaliyah's breathing remained shallow, her mind alternating between fear, confusion, and cautious calculation. She tried to focus on practicalities, how to answer questions, how to comply without escalating the situation, how to maintain composure, but the emotional weight was immense. The fear of being misunderstood, of being judged unfairly, of being powerless in the face of authority, loomed large, yet she met it with quiet determination, refusing to surrender entirely to panic. Hours, or what felt like hours, though only minutes had passed, stretched in a tense continuum. Each moment reinforced the surreal and frightening nature of her experience. Aaliyah felt both acutely vulnerable and quietly resilient, trapped in a liminal space between fear and courage. She understood, even in the throes of confusion, that this moment would define her strength, her ability to endure, and her capacity to face injustice without compromising her dignity. The moment the police officer stepped closer to Aaliyah, the entire terminal seemed to shift. The hum of conversations, the rolling of suitcases, the announcements over the loudspeakers, all became background noise to the intensity of what was happening at her gate. She felt the pressure of countless eyes on her, some curious, some skeptical, some quietly judging. Every glance from a passerby, every subtle movement of a nearby traveler seemed amplified, as if the very air around her was measuring her worthiness, her guilt, her innocence. She tried to stand as still as possible, her fingers gripping the strap of her backpack with tight determination, as though holding onto it could anchor her in reality, could prevent her from being swept away by the tide of suspicion crashing around her. The officer's approach was measured, deliberate, each step echoing slightly on the polished floor, drawing the attention of more and more passengers. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, a low murmur that grew into something heavier, a subtle tension that wrapped itself around Aaliyah like a thick, invisible fog. "What's happening over there?" someone whispered. "Why is the cop talking to that girl?" Another muttered, "She doesn't look like she belongs in trouble. Why would they stop her?" None of the voices were directed at her, but each carried the weight of scrutiny, the subtle implication that this was extraordinary, suspicious, and possibly dangerous. Aaliyah's chest tightened with each new wave of observation, her pulse quickening as she realized just how public her ordeal had become. The flight attendant, standing a few steps away, seemed almost oblivious to the growing crowd, her eyes locked solely on Aaliyah. Her voice was calm but firm, clipped in its tone. "Ma'am, I just need to confirm a few details about your travel," she said. Aaliyah nodded, her lips dry, her voice trembling slightly as she answered. She repeated her full name, her destination, and explained once more why she was traveling alone. Each answer felt rehearsed, mechanical, as if repeating the truth louder or more clearly could somehow convince the skeptics around her that she posed no threat. Yet every word seemed to hang in the air, unanswered by the universe around her, as though the suspicion that had been cast was heavier than the facts themselves. The officer crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to her eye level, and asked to see her identification again. The gesture should have been routine, simple, but in the charged atmosphere of the terminal, it felt monumental, accusatory even. Aaliyah handed over her ID, her hands steadying only because she forced them to, though inside, anxiety churned like a storm at sea. The officer examined it with a professional gaze, and Aaliyah felt the seconds stretch endlessly. She could sense every passenger watching, every whisper folding into another, creating a cacophony of suspicion that surrounded her, a noise that threatened to drown out her reason and composure. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react, yet unable to look away. Others fidgeted with their phones, some clearly recording, some pretending to be absorbed in their screens while stealing glances at the unfolding drama. Aaliyah felt exposed, as though her every movement was being analyzed and measured. She tried to slow her breathing, counting silently to herself, grounding each inhale and exhale with the knowledge that panic would only make the situation worse. Still, the fear remained, clawing at the edges of her mind. The unfairness of it all, the fact that she was being treated this way for no reason, was almost unbearable, and yet, she had to endure it, had to maintain her dignity, even under the weight of unjust scrutiny. The flight attendant asked another question, this time about her seating arrangement. Aaliyah explained politely that she had already confirmed her seat with the online check-in process, had verified it with the gate staff, and had ensured she had all her documents in order. The officer nodded, taking notes on a small pad, but the subtle tension in his posture never relaxed. Aaliyah could see the calculations behind his eyes, the invisible checklist he was running, measuring her compliance, her behavior, her every gesture. Every blink, every tilt of her head, every movement of her hands seemed to be catalogued, evaluated, scrutinized for signs of deception. She had never felt so powerless in her life, so acutely aware of the microscopic gaze of authority focused entirely on her. Aaliyah tried to engage her surroundings as a means of comfort, scanning the terminal, trying to find something familiar, something ordinary. But the usual signs of airport life, the announcements, the boarding lines, the coffee stands, were overshadowed by the tension. The crowd seemed to pulse around her, each person's curiosity adding weight to her already tense body. She caught snippets of conversation, some clearly sympathetic, "That's so unfair. Why would they stop her?" Others murmured quietly, speculative, "Something must have happened, right? Maybe there's a security issue." Every word, every glance, felt like another measurement of her presence, another verification of her supposed wrongdoing. The officer asked her to step aside, just a few feet away from the gate counter, ostensibly to check her documents more thoroughly. Aaliyah complied, moving with deliberate care, aware that any misstep could be interpreted as evasiveness. She felt the eyes of the passengers shift with her movement, some craning their necks to see her better, others leaning back, uncomfortable but unable to look away. The flow of the terminal seemed to slow around her, the usual rhythm of departures and arrivals suspended, as though the world itself had decided to pause and observe her every action. Her internal anxiety grew with each passing second. Aaliyah questioned herself, wondering if she had somehow missed a rule, violated a subtle policy, or unintentionally provoked the suspicion now hanging over her like a storm cloud. She had followed every instruction at security, complied with every request, and traveled honestly and independently, yet the scrutiny continued unabated. The absurdity of the situation collided with her fear, creating a mental tension that made it difficult to think clearly, as though her mind were walking a tightrope over a pit of doubt and confusion. Some passengers began to whisper to one another more openly, drawing attention to the situation. "Why would a cop need to talk to her?" one asked quietly. Another added, "It doesn't make sense. She's traveling alone, but she's not a threat." Aaliyah could feel their eyes on her, their curiosity merging with an unspoken empathy, though it was tempered by hesitation. No one intervened directly. The fear of overstepping boundaries in a public space was tangible, leaving her isolated in her spotlight of scrutiny. She noticed a few people subtly reaching for their phones, some pretending to check messages while filming the encounter, perhaps to document the injustice they perceived. The awareness that this situation could go viral, that strangers could judge her without knowing the full story, added another layer of pressure to an already overwhelming moment. Aaliyah clenched her hands into fists inside her backpack straps, grounding herself with the texture and weight of the fabric, reminding herself that she had done nothing wrong, that truth and patience were her strongest allies. Her thoughts shifted to the surreal nature of the event. Airports were supposed to be neutral, routine spaces designed to facilitate travel. Yet here, in the middle of an ordinary terminal, Aaliyah found herself at the center of an extraordinary and frightening scene. The normal rules of fairness and reason seemed suspended, replaced by an arbitrary judgment she could neither predict nor influence. The dissonance between her expectations and her reality heightened the tension, making each moment feel both unreal and painfully immediate. The officer asked more questions, probing deeper into her travel arrangements, her itinerary, her family connections, and her plans at her destination. Aaliyah answered as calmly and clearly as she could, careful to maintain steady eye contact and controlled gestures. The trembling in her hands had subsided slightly, replaced by a tense alertness, but the fear remained, simmering beneath the surface. Every word, every action was calculated, a careful balance between honesty and caution, between self-preservation and composure. She observed the passengers around her more closely now. Some were quietly observing, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. Others whispered to companions, sharing opinions and speculations. Aaliyah could feel their thoughts like a subtle, heavy current, weighing on her even as she tried to remain grounded. The collective attention was both alienating and strangely comforting, a reminder that the injustice she faced was visible, recognized, and witnessed, even if it could not yet be corrected. Time stretched again, moments feeling like hours, as the officer continued his careful assessment. The flight attendant's presence remained constant, her expression unreadable, her gaze unwavering. Every interaction, every micro-expression, every pause carried significance in the heightened reality Aaliyah now inhabited. She counted breaths, focused on subtle physical anchors, the weight of her backpack, the sensation of the floor beneath her feet, the sound of her own heartbeat, to maintain a sense of control amidst the escalating tension. Aaliyah felt the isolation keenly. Though surrounded by strangers, she was alone in her experience, the only one fully aware of the fear, confusion, and injustice she faced. She had to rely on her own strength, her own composure, her own ability to navigate the situation. She reminded herself of previous challenges she had overcome, of moments when she had faced adversity with courage. That memory became a fragile shield, a reminder that she could endure this as well. The whispers continued, a subtle but persistent reminder of the crowd's attention. Aaliyah realized that her ordeal was no longer private, that the entire terminal had become a stage on which she was being judged. She felt exposed, yet she also recognized the power in endurance, the ability to remain composed, honest, and true to herself, even under extreme scrutiny. Every carefully measured word, every deliberate movement, became an assertion of control in an otherwise uncontrollable situation. Her mind continued to cycle through possibilities, contingency plans, and potential outcomes. She considered explaining further, seeking another staff member for assistance, or requesting to speak with a supervisor. Each thought was weighed against the risk of escalation, the fear of being misunderstood, the pressure of public scrutiny. She realized that in this moment, the most powerful tool she possessed was her calm, her honesty, and her unwavering commitment to truth. Aaliyah's pulse remained rapid, but she focused on grounding herself, on maintaining clarity. She repeated her itinerary silently in her mind, retraced each step she had taken from entering the airport, and reaffirmed her innocence. The world outside her awareness continued its normal rhythm, planes taxiing, announcements echoing, passengers moving to their gates. Yet within the bubble of scrutiny that surrounded her, time felt suspended, each second stretching indefinitely as she endured the heightened attention. She noticed a few passengers offering subtle signs of empathy, brief nods, shared glances, and soft expressions that suggested recognition of the injustice she faced. Though small, these gestures provided a faint reassurance that she was not entirely alone, that some observers understood the absurdity and unfairness of the moment. Yet the fear and tension remained dominant, a constant reminder that the situation was unresolved and unpredictable. Aaliyah reminded herself repeatedly, breathe, stay calm, be honest, endure. Each mantra became a lifeline, a way to assert agency over her body and mind. Though fear remained, though confusion persisted, she realized that she could survive this moment, maintain her composure, and navigate the scrutiny with dignity. She had no other choice but to persist, to stand tall under the weight of unjust attention, and to trust in her own strength and resilience. The minutes continued to stretch, each interaction reinforcing the intensity of the scene. Aaliyah's awareness sharpened, every movement, every micro-expression, every subtle cue from the officer, the flight attendant, and the passengers was noted, processed, and carefully measured. She maintained steady breathing, focused on grounding sensations, and relied on the truth of her circumstances as an anchor amidst the storm of fear and observation. Just when Aaliyah felt as though the weight of the entire terminal pressed down upon her, and the fear, confusion, and tension had reached a nearly unbearable peak, a sudden shift rippled through the air. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the first tremor before a quake. The murmurs of passengers shifted, glances began to move purposefully toward the gate entrance, and a new presence entered the scene with quiet authority that immediately drew attention. Aaliyah didn't know it yet, but her father had arrived. He had been informed through the airline's internal channels, alerted to a situation that had escalated beyond routine protocol. His steps were calm, measured, yet carried an undeniable power, the kind that commands attention without the need for raised voices or physical force. Aaliyah noticed the change almost instinctively. The subtle stiffness in the flight attendant's posture, the slight pause in the officer's movements, the way passengers straightened in their seats and shifted closer to observe, all were signs that someone significant had entered the space. Even in her fear and exhaustion, Aaliyah's pulse quickened with a flicker of hope, a tiny ember that suggested a possible end to the ordeal. She glanced toward the new figure moving with deliberate ease through the crowd, feeling a mixture of disbelief and relief as recognition slowly dawned. Her father's presence was magnetic. People instinctively gave him space, their curiosity tempered by the respect that authority and recognition demanded. He was sharply dressed, his posture upright, exuding the confidence and composure of someone used to making decisions that impacted thousands. Yet, there was a gentleness in his eyes as they locked on Aaliyah, a reassurance that she had not experienced since the ordeal began. She felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly, as if the invisible weight of scrutiny had lifted just enough to allow her a breath of relief. The flight attendant, who had moments ago seemed unshakable in her suspicion, faltered almost imperceptibly. Her hands paused mid-note, her voice hitched slightly as she glanced toward the man approaching. The officer, too, straightened and adjusted his posture, a subtle acknowledgement that the authority in the room had shifted, that the dynamics had changed in a way neither of them had expected. The terminal itself seemed to respond, the noise dimming slightly, as passengers sensed that a resolution was imminent, that someone with the power to end the tension had arrived. Aaliyah's heart pounded as her father reached her side. The officer, still maintaining professional composure, opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to explain, perhaps to assert his role, but the CEO's calm presence and quiet authority were enough to halt him mid-sentence. His voice, low but commanding, carried effortlessly over the soft murmur of the terminal. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes sweeping over the officer and the flight attendant. There was no anger in his tone, only a controlled insistence for clarity and honesty. The shift was immediate. The people who had been scrutinizing Aaliyah, the officers who had questioned her, and the staff who had watched with suspicion now found themselves being measured in turn. The flight attendant hesitated, a bead of uncertainty flickering across her expression. She stammered slightly, trying to explain, to justify the actions she had taken, but the CEO's presence was disarming. His gaze was steady, composed, but carried an unspoken weight that made it impossible to continue without full transparency. Aaliyah, still gripping her backpack, watched in awe as her father navigated the scene, commanding respect without a single raised hand. She felt a surge of relief and pride, realizing that the nightmare she had endured for what felt like hours was now meeting its turning point. Passengers who had been observing in hushed curiosity now began to whisper among themselves, their tones shifting from speculation to incredulity. "Is that?" one asked softly. Another murmured, "He must be someone important. Look how everyone is reacting." The collective attention that had previously isolated Aaliyah now seemed to bend toward her father, as though the air itself acknowledged the sudden change in circumstance. Her anxiety began to ebb slightly, replaced by a cautious optimism that the ordeal would finally be resolved. Her father knelt slightly, coming to her level without breaking the formality of his presence, and spoke in a tone that was both calm and reassuring. "It's okay, Aaliyah," he said. The words were simple, yet they carried a depth of comfort that made her shoulders release some of the tension they had held so rigidly. She felt the fear she had carried for what seemed like an eternity begin to melt, replaced with the warmth of protection and understanding. His presence alone was a shield, a buffer against the unfair scrutiny that had dominated her life for the past tense minutes. The officer and the flight attendant now found themselves on the defensive, subtly aware that the narrative of authority had shifted. The officer held up Aaliyah's identification and travel documents, but the CEO's calm command made it clear that any continued action beyond verification would be unnecessary. The flight attendant's attempts at further questioning ceased, replaced by careful compliance, an acknowledgement of the authority and clarity that her arrival had brought. The subtle tension that had suffused the terminal began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of resolution that radiated quietly but undeniably. Aaliyah's gaze followed her father as he spoke softly to the staff, ensuring that the situation was fully understood and that no further misunderstanding could occur. He was meticulous in his words, precise and clear, yet his tone remained approachable, patient, and composed. The crowd began to sense the shift, the resolution of the conflict, and murmurs of relief spread through the nearby passengers. Aaliyah's fear had not entirely vanished, but the burden of it lifted, replaced by gratitude and the faint thrill of vindication. The passengers who had been watching now allowed themselves to exhale, to relax, to return to the flow of the terminal around them. Some whispered quietly to companions, speculating about the identity of the man who had arrived with such calm authority. Others offered subtle nods of acknowledgement or fleeting smiles directed toward Aaliyah, as though recognizing that what she had endured was unjust, and that her endurance was remarkable. She felt a rush of emotion at these small gestures, a validation that her ordeal had not gone unnoticed, that the injustice had been corrected, at least in part. Her father remained with her, his presence a constant reassurance, until the officer stepped back, satisfied that no further action was necessary. The subtle tension in the officer's posture relaxed, and he returned to his duties, leaving Aaliyah free from the scrutiny and suspicion that had dominated the past tense minutes. The flight attendant, too, shifted her stance, the earlier air of judgment replaced by professional acknowledgement that the situation had been clarified and resolved. Aaliyah felt a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and awe at the sudden shift from fear to security. She turned her gaze fully toward her father, her eyes wide with gratitude and disbelief. The intensity of the experience, the fear, the confusion, and the scrutiny all seemed to coalesce into a moment of profound realization. She was safe, protected, and vindicated. The combination of her endurance, her composure, and her father's timely arrival had transformed an ordeal that had felt endless into a moment of resolution and calm. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, a mix of relief and emotion that had been building throughout the ordeal. Passengers around them began to resume their normal routines, some casting discreet glances back at Aaliyah and her father, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and respect. The terminal buzzed once again with its usual energy, though now it carried a subtle undercurrent of awe at the sudden, dramatic turn of events. Aaliyah felt a renewed sense of strength, a knowledge that she had endured a profound test of patience, composure, and courage. Her father's presence had not only resolved the immediate threat but also reminded her of the power of protection, authority, and advocacy in a world that could sometimes be harsh and unpredictable. As they began to walk toward the boarding gate together, her father's hand gently resting on her shoulder, Aaliyah allowed herself to breathe deeply for the first time since the ordeal had begun. The tension that had gripped her chest eased, replaced by a quiet, simmering confidence. She realized that fear and confusion, though powerful, could be met with resilience, patience, and the support of those who cared for her. She felt a sense of closure settling over her, a recognition that the unjust scrutiny she had endured had ended, and that she had emerged with her dignity intact. The flight attendant offered a brief nod of acknowledgement as they passed, a subtle but clear gesture indicating that the situation had been resolved and that no further action would be taken. The officer, too, maintained a professional distance, ensuring that protocol had been followed but no further intimidation would occur. Aaliyah felt a deep, almost overwhelming sense of relief, realizing that the nightmare she had endured was now firmly behind her, replaced by the reassurance of family, authority, and truth prevailing. Her father's calm guidance continued as they approached the boarding area. Each step was measured, deliberate, and protective, a reminder that she was no longer alone, that the fear that had dominated the last tense minutes was now under control. Passengers who had observed the ordeal offered subtle nods of recognition or whispered among themselves, acknowledging the dramatic yet just resolution. Aaliyah's confidence grew with each step, her earlier fear now tempered by the knowledge that she had survived, endured, and been vindicated. As they reached the gate counter, her father addressed the remaining staff with professionalism and authority, ensuring that the flight could proceed smoothly and that no further complications would arise. The flight attendant complied, her tone respectful, and the officer stepped aside, acknowledging the resolution. Aaliyah felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mixture of pride, relief, and gratitude. She realized that the ordeal had not broken her, but had instead revealed her capacity for resilience, her ability to endure fear, and the power of truth and authority in restoring justice. The boarding process resumed its normal rhythm, the hum of the terminal returning to familiar patterns. Aaliyah walked beside her father, feeling a renewed sense of safety and empowerment. She reflected on the intense minutes of fear, confusion, and scrutiny, understanding now that those experiences, though difficult, had strengthened her, teaching lessons about endurance, trust, and the importance of having advocates in positions of authority. The air that had once felt oppressive now seemed lighter, the terminal's noise a comforting background to the knowledge that she had survived an ordeal with courage and composure. Aaliyah's eyes met her father's once more, gratitude and awe reflected in her gaze. The relief that had been building within her now surged fully, washing over her like a tide, mingling with pride and the quiet thrill of vindication. The situation that had begun with fear and confusion had ended in resolution and safety, a testament to her endurance and the protective presence of someone who loved and understood her. She felt her shoulders relax fully, her chest unburdened, and her mind clear for the first time in what had seemed like endless moments of tension. The passengers continued their movements, some catching glimpses of the young girl and her father as they proceeded toward the gate, others resuming their routines with a subtle sense of having witnessed something extraordinary. Aaliyah, still gripping her backpack, felt a sense of empowerment and perspective that had not been present at the beginning of the ordeal. The fear and confusion that had dominated her mind had been replaced with clarity, understanding, and the quiet knowledge that she had endured something significant and emerged with her dignity and composure intact. Her father spoke softly as they reached the gate, his words calm but reassuring, emphasizing that the situation was resolved and that she was safe. Aaliyah felt a deep sense of relief and validation, recognizing that the fear, confusion, and scrutiny she had faced were now behind her. The terminal, once a scene of tension and suspicion, now felt ordinary again, its hum a comforting reminder of the routine life that awaited her beyond the ordeal. Walking toward the boarding area, Aaliyah realized that she had learned something profound about resilience, endurance, and the importance of having someone who could step in and advocate for her. The ordeal had tested her patience, composure, and courage, and she had passed, emerging stronger and more confident. Her fear, once all-consuming, had been tempered by the presence of authority and the reassurance of truth prevailing over suspicion. As she prepared to board the plane, Aaliyah took a final, deep breath, feeling the tension leave her body. The fear, confusion, and scrutiny of the past tense minutes had been replaced by calm, reassurance, and empowerment. She looked at her father, a mixture of gratitude, pride, and love reflected in her eyes, understanding that the ordeal had not only tested her but also revealed the strength, courage, and resilience she possessed. The boarding process continued, passengers filing onto the plane, the terminal returning fully to its normal rhythm. Aaliyah, hand in hand metaphorically with her father's protective presence, stepped forward with a newfound confidence, knowing that the ordeal she had endured had strengthened her in ways she would carry with her forever. The fear and confusion that had dominated the previous moments were now memories, lessons learned and survived, leaving her ready to continue her journey with courage and dignity.